Welcome everybody. I'm really excited about this week's installment of the Ethics, Law, and Society Forum. Today's speaker is Shannon Vallor. She's the William J. Ruick Professor in the Department of Philosophy at Santa Clara University. She's also the president of the International Society for Philosophy and Technology and the winner of the 2015 World Technology Award in Ethics. Her work focuses on the intersection of philosophy, science, and technology, and in particular she's focused on how technologies interact with us to affect our character. And her book, if you're interested in learning more, is called Technology and the Virtues, and it was published last year by Oxford University Press, so it's available at all good bookstores. Her talk today is entitled The Robotic Mirror, Finding Humanity in Machine Values. Please join me in welcoming Shannon Vallor.
Thank you, Joshua, and thanks to all of you for coming out today and having me here. It's great to be able to talk to you. So I will not go through who I am, since the introduction I think already covered that. But I will say that my work in this area started in part because of the response that I got from students when I first started talking about these issues in my classes. I originally identified simply as a philosopher of science, and I wanted to talk about the way that technology and science connect, and also the way that technology really helps to define the kind of environments that we live in. And when my students responded to that with the enthusiasm that they did, I realized that there were a lot of philosophical issues here that hadn't been adequately explored, particularly in the area of ethics of emerging technology. So that's been my research focus for about the last 10 years or so. So my research then essentially focuses these days on ethics of AI and automation, ethics of military and social robotics. I've done a little bit of work on the ethics of biomedical enhancement, and I've done some work on new social media ethics. But I'm also more broadly interested in, again, the relationship between science and technology, the kinds of virtues that we develop in scientific practices, the role of technologies in scientific observation, modeling, simulation, and so forth. My book that was published last year, Technology and the Virtues, A Philosophical Guide to a Future Worth Wanting, uses the philosophical ethics that we typically call virtue ethics, although I draw from multiple philosophical frameworks, Aristotle, Confucius, Buddhism, to think about virtue ethics in a contemporary global context that might be applicable to thinking about how to live well with emerging technologies. But this talk today is one of the first talks I've done since the book that's not essentially drawn from the book. So the good news is you're getting some very fresh thoughts of mine. The bad news is they're fresh, therefore they're not as perhaps polished and refined as they might have been. So I'm interested to see how things progress in the discussion. So I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end, if not more, for some open discussion of some of the points that I bring up today. So I'm going to start with just an overview for those of you who might not be familiar with the ethical issues that are emerging with respect to robotics. So there's a whole range of applications coming forward. Some of you may not be inclined to think of self-driving cars as robots, but in a robust way, they really are. The kinds of technologies that are going to be built into self-driving cars are the kinds of technologies that we would build into any intelligent robotic system. And a lot of the ethical issues that apply to robotics come up in the self-driving car context. Healthcare robots, which brings together some traditional issues of medical ethics and bioethics with the distinctive questions that come out of social robotics and law and policy. So there are a lot of interesting ethical issues that are going to come forward as robots begin to play a greater role in our healthcare settings. Other kinds of social robots, robots that are designed specifically to interact with us as companions, as friends, as assistants, and there are going to be a great many more applications of these technologies in the future. So robotics are going to come out of the factories and into our personal lives in ways that we've never experienced before, and frankly are not really prepared for. So there's going to be a lot of issues that are going to come up to talk about. And of course, military robotics. More and more investment globally in military technology is going in the direction of robots, and particularly in the area of greater autonomy. That is, robots that can act more and more independently of human direction. And when we think about robots carrying lethal weapons, that obviously raises a whole host of new ethical issues to consider. Okay, so a lot of the questions that we have in the field of robot ethics are really questions about the way that new robotic technologies will impact human values, things that matter to us as a species, as a society, profoundly. So the first set of slides are really going to be identifying some fundamental human values and then showing how a large number of questions that we are asking in robot ethics are connected with these values. So if we start with compassion, we can ask ourselves, how can robots be designed safely and compassionately in ways that do not expose human beings to undue harms, even when doing so will advance a system goal? So we talk about friendly AI, we talk about safe AI, and it might not be immediately obvious that compassion has any relevance here, but the reason that we care about friendly AI is not just because we don't want robots to hurt us. It's also because, in general, we don't want robots to be injurious to the human family, for whom, if we're normal moral beings, we have compassion. So how can we promote the design of robots that will recognize human suffering and act to address it in ethically acceptable ways, right? If you have a robot that has some degree of autonomy and you don't want it to inflict suffering, or you don't want it to perpetuate suffering, then it has to have some capacity to recognize suffering or signs of it. And so you're thinking then already about designing a robot that can somehow act in ways that mirror human compassion. How can robots, especially those entrusted with access to critical data or systems essential to human being, be designed to recognize and resist malicious programming, hacking, abuse, or malware that aims to weaponize a robot against a human's vital interest? So how can you design robots that will recognize threats to human well-being and act in an appropriate way? We also have a lot of questions about robots and justice. How can we manage, first of all, the risks to human well-being posed by technological unemployment from robots and AI automation? This is a huge topic that's being discussed right now because there are some very alarming projections about the percentage of human occupations that might be rendered mostly redundant by robotic labor. And not only are there a lot of jobs threatened by robots, but more and more of those jobs involve relatively high-level cognitive functioning from humans, right? So we're not talking just about robots that will replace those jobs we like to call the dull, dirty, and dangerous, the 3Ds. There's a new wave of robots and AI systems that are capable of replacing humans in the kinds of jobs that humans actually like to do. And this ought to be of some concern. And it's a justice issue because it's a question of economic justice, right? Who will benefit from the gains in productivity, from the efficiency of these machines? If humans don't benefit, if in fact we lose, then there's a profound issue of justice here. So how can we ensure that the economic benefits of robot and AI labor are justly distributed rather than shared only with the wealthy few? There's a whole range of other questions having to do with the justice of machine judgments. We already know that many algorithms have implicit biases built into them because of the way that they are trained on human data sets that basically contain the same human biases that we bring to our judgments. So it's common to think of a machine as neutral, as having no particular biases, but that's actually not true at all. Most advanced machine intelligence mirrors our own biases and our own injustices in a variety of ways. So how can we detect and eliminate those biases. There's a range of questions that have to do with just our general value as humans on sociality. We don't often think of sociality as a value, but it's one of the most fundamental ones. We might talk about, instead of sociality, we might talk about affinity or relationality, whatever kind of word you want to attach. We're social creatures. We seek pleasurable and rewarding and mutual bonds with other people. And robots are entering into these relationships in ways that will create a lot of interesting phenomena. So what kind of social roles should robots and AI agents occupy? Should we welcome them as caregivers for the elderly or the sick? This goes back to the healthcare robots question. Nannies and babysitters for our children. Right? Amazon already has an Alexa for your kid that they're about to roll out, right? Mattel has one too called Aristotle, oddly enough. Teachers and teaching assistants. Georgia Tech has already run a graduate level online AI course with a teaching assistant, a graduate teaching assistant for the course that was an AI agent. And the students never figured it out until the end of the quarter when the professor revealed that their teaching assistant was Jill Watson, i.e. IBM's Watson technology. Law enforcement agents and soldiers. We talked about military robots. Well, we know that a lot of military technology makes its way back down into the domestic context. So we don't just have to think about the international implications of lethal military robotics. We have to think about the domestic issues. We already have a lot of social conflicts and questions that arise out of the militarization of local law enforcement. Robots are only going to make that issue more acute. Should we have robots as legal or judicial advisors? And here, again, you'll notice that I'm blurring the line between robots and artificial intelligence. I'll say a little bit more about the way that these two technologies flow into each other. But you already have software systems today that advise judges on sentencing and parole recommendations. And judges are already relying on these systems in evaluating the risk that a particular defendant or convict poses. And so we already have these justice issues in play. Should we have robots as romantic partners? Right? So there's a whole debate happening about sex bots and the ethics and policy of sex bots. Should we be able to consider a robot a friend? So there are questions here about how robots will come into the social patterns that make our lives rich and happy, and whether they have any role to play at all. Most people think it's inevitable that they will have a role in our social lives. And if that's true, the question is, what boundaries, if any, do we want to draw? What conditions do we want to place on the integration of robots into our relational networks? So how do we ensure that social robots are not designed in ways that intrude upon, weaken, or damage human social relations and values? And can we do the opposite? Can we design them to not only do damage, but to actually help make our social relations stronger, more rewarding, healthier? Could robots have a therapeutic purpose in some of our relationships? And then there are questions about responsibility. Responsibility is a central human value. It's part of how we stand up and own our lives and our choices, right? By taking responsibility for them. But now we have robots that are acting more and more autonomously, independently of human direction. So can a robot be safely placed in what we might call a position of responsibility? And what would that mean? Whether we're talking about a robot that makes a decision about whether to target a human being for lethal action, or whether we're talking about a robot that makes a decision about how to respond to your child's emotional breakdown while it's in the robot's care. We have to be able to think about what it would mean to place a robot in a position of responsibility. Who will be held responsible if an autonomous self-learning robot injures or harms a human? And which social, political, and economic institutions, groups, or persons will be responsible for steering or governing appropriate robotics technology? Right now, there is no clear answer to this question, and no one has any central authority over the governance of robotics technology. So the big question that I want to pose here today, that I think everything I've said so far can kind of come under this heading, is this: how can we promote responsible robotics design, engineering, and use? And this is the fundamental charge of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics that I'm a part of, and that really seeks to answer this question. So the second half of my talk then tries to think about a way to answer that question, one way to answer that question. I think there's got to be more than one answer. So I want to talk about robotics and machine values. Okay, what do I mean by a machine value? A machine value is one that's enhanced by the cultural context of mechanized industry and science, right? So a value, if you will, that comes more to the center as we orient our lives more and more around mechanization. It's also, in a sense, a misnomer. Machine or robot values are human values, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. They just happen to be those values that suit themselves well to implementation and maximization by machine judgment. So if you take away one thing from this talk, I want it to be this idea: robots are us all the way down. They aren't exactly like us, and that's where the slippage and the gap comes in, but they are still us. We create them, we invest them with our values. So another way of thinking about a machine value is that it's a value that's algorithmically represented and operationalized in a machine, or a value that is best achieved by mechanized systems. Okay. So let me give you some examples of machine values in the context of robotics. So here's a bunch of them, and I'll go through them one by one. Okay. So let's start with optimality. So optimality is the ability, usually through algorithmic representation, to mathematically map a problem space and the goals and obstacles in that problem space, and figure out a course of action that will optimize the values that the system is programmed to consider, okay? And in order to optimize that, you're essentially taking a complex value environment that has values of a lot of different sorts, right? Social values, economic values, moral values, emotional values. And you're taking those and compressing them into an algorithm, into a mathematical formula that can sum over all these values and preferences, and then choose the optimal course of action that maximizes them, okay? So optimizing is something that robots, especially and particularly robots that are invested with advanced machine intelligence, which is not to say anything like human intelligence, right? It's something that these kinds of machines do very, very well. And again, machine values are the kinds of things that machines do especially well, but they're still our values. We want these machines to be good at optimizing. But the problem is that humans operate in these complex value environments that arguably cannot be compressed into a single dimension, okay? Our values are what I would like to say is, I'll come back to that, irreducibly complex, right? The values that we care about often are of such a different sort that we can't figure out how to optimize and have it all, right? Have the best case scenario. There are tragic necessities in human choice. By tragic, I mean where we have to lose something that we really value. And so machines aren't good at those kinds of decision-making contexts, because they need to compress and optimize all the values into a single formula. And an example of this is the way that language about what is right or what is good for a machine to do gets translated into what AI designers call utility functions. Utility functions, anyone here who's got a background in certain aspects of economics will be familiar with the notion of a utility function. It's, again, a way of mathematically representing human preferences and values and figuring out how to maximize over, ideally, a long-term period, the expected utility of certain choices. Okay? Now, one of the things that economists have learned, of course, is that humans are not utility maximizers. That is, we don't always behave as a perfectly rational, self-interested agent would behave. We make choices that violate, often, the logic of expected utility. But machines don't. Machines are built to be expected utility maximizers. So the kinds of moral choices that we make, then, are different from the kinds of choices that robots are programmed to make. And if we talk about robot ethics, we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind that they will treat every morally loaded choice as a utility function, which is very different from how a human thinker in a moral context will operate. The other thing about optimality is that a system that is programmed to optimize will tend to seek the optimal solution and preserve it, right? To keep itself performing at that optimal point. Well, if you think about the way that that would lead society, we often value change and development of society in new directions, even when we think that where we are is a pretty good place to be. So one worry we might have about machine systems taking over more and more of our human decisions is whether that might lead to a kind of pattern of stasis in human society, where the machines decide what the optimal condition is and direct us to stay in that state rather than consider other kinds of options. Okay, I'll talk about some other machine values here. Efficiency, right? So a machine has all its values instrumentalized relative to certain system goals, what it has been designed to do, its function, okay? So values then are never, from a machine standpoint, intrinsic. They are simply means to an end. And the machine will take the most efficient path to achieve its end, its system goal. So we have to think about how to treat machines that have efficiency as their dominant mode of value behavior. Speed. Speed gives machines a decisional advantage over humans, right? And because that advantage has economic value, speed becomes a value. A machine that can think faster than a human can give humans a certain advantage. So even though the quality of speed is something that gives the machine an advantage over us, you see that it's still a human value, right? It's us wanting that speed, wanting to leverage that speed. Precision is the same. Precision allows machines to have a calculative advantage over humans. It can analyze situations to a degree that a human could never accomplish, given a lifetime of thought. So we have a lot of heuristics, a lot of rough and ready ways of solving problems that machines can essentially drive right through because they can do the calculations that we can't. This gives an advantage over humans, but yet again, it's an advantage that humans enjoy and are able to leverage through the machine. Reliability. Machines have a stability advantage over humans. They can be, assuming there's no mechanical malfunction, they can be more or less predicted to perform the same way with the same efficiency, with the same speed over and over and over again. They don't get tired, they don't get cranky, they don't get distracted. They don't have bad days. Readability. The ability of machines to process information in the world is something that humans will never be able to compete with because we process information differently. The informational advantage that machines have to process much larger data flows and to hold on to and calculate with multiple pieces of information when a human mind can really only handle 5 to 7 pieces of information at one time. Okay? That advantage means that we have an incentive, if we want to leverage this advantage, we have an incentive to make the world more and more readable to machines. The philosopher Luciano Floridi and others have talked about this, about how we are, in a sense, turning the world into a text for machines to read in the ways that we feed our machines more and more data through all of the things that we do on our phones, all that data that's collected. There's an incentive to make the world more and more readable by computers, and that changes the kind of environment that we're living in. Compressibility, again, what machines need in order to maximize their computational advantage is the kind of lossless reduction of informational complexity that allows them to calculate things that we cannot. So there's an incentive in machine language to compress large data sets into a reduced form that can be processed quickly and efficiently. But it's not clear that compressing human experience is always a good thing. And there are some potential losses that we can talk about with this. Replicability, right? Machines, once you have a robot, you can make 10 of them. Once you have an algorithm, you can implant it in any number of systems that are capable of employing it. So these kinds of systems exist as kind of an economic force multiplier, if you will. And that's, again, why they're a human value as well. The ability to replicate the power of these machines so easily is an economic value, and yet it also gives the robots an economic advantage over us. It's why jobs, human jobs, may be threatened in the future, right? Not just because they're faster, not just because they can process more information, but because they can be, once you have one robot that can solve the problem, you can have 10 or 100 or 1,000. And invulnerability. Machines don't have the same kind of embodied vulnerabilities that humans do. They can't be emotionally manipulated. They can't be worn down physically in the same way as humans can. Of course, they're mechanical systems. They still need power. They still have needs. They're vulnerable in some sense, right? But not in the same ways that humans are. And again, that gives them an advantage over us, but also creates that advantage that other humans seek to leverage through employing them in our society. So the last part of my talk then is to think about the relationship between those human values that I started with and the machine values. And I sort of call this the robotic mirror. All designed human artifacts are mirrors of human value, robots included. And that goes to that notion of robots are us all the way down, right? That I don't want us to forget. But just as my image in the mirror is still mine, even though it is in some sense detached from me, right? The image now appears over there. Our robotic mirrors are still us, but they're now externalized and transformed. So robotic mirrors, that is, mirrors of human values, may magnify, reduce, narrow, invert, distort, center, or decenter human values, right? They can make some human values like speed and efficiency more important in a particular context and more likely to be optimized or pursued than other values like compassion or justice, which are much harder to represent algorithmically and resist the kind of optimality calculations that machines are good at, right? Now, this might not always work against human values. We might, for example, find machines that can take a human value that exists in the margins that deserves more attention and perhaps bring it more to the forefront, right? So I don't want to suggest that there aren't ways that robots could transform our values in positive directions. But if we're being honest about the kinds of contexts in which robots are likely to be used, and the economic motivations primarily, the economic and political motivations that will be behind them, it's not clear that we can count on robots not to distort our values or decenter our values in ways that could be socially destructive. So then responsible robot design is design that takes deliberate account of these mirror effects on human values and their possible impact on human lives and institutions. So that's my answer to the question of how we get, or what would it mean to have responsible robot design. My argument is that responsible robot design would be one that would take account of the ways that robots are magnifying, reducing, narrowing, inverting, distorting, centering, or decentering human values that we still have reason to care about. So, in a way, what I'm talking about is humanizing machine values that are already human, right? But bringing them back to the human center, where we are the ones deciding which values are the most important in any particular context. In humanizing machine values, I think it's very important to see this as resisting the temptation to pursue a strategy of reverse adaptation. Here I'm quoting John Sullins, who you have the pleasure of having here on your campus, who has talked about this. So reverse adaptation is the idea that, well, the machines are set up in such a way, and these are their strengths, and these are the kinds of problems that they're good at solving, and these are the values that they're good at maximizing. So let's just re-engineer our institutions, our habits, our practices to fit what the machines are good at, or what the machines will let us do. So instead of expecting the robot design to meet our needs, we allow our needs to be changed to fit the robot's capacities and affordances. This is a very, very dangerous path to pursue, and we can say more about that. So I'm talking here then about the reverse operation, ensuring that we are keeping the human value standpoint at the center. And to do that, we need to audit the outcomes of implementations of robotic and artificially intelligent systems. And we need to audit those outcomes using robustly human and machine values, right? So we need to audit the machines not just by measuring the outcomes in terms of their efficiency and productivity and speed and reliability, but also auditing them in terms of things like justice and compassion and responsibility, and those values that are still harder to operationalize and represent algorithmically. We need to try to conserve moral complexity rather than reduce it or eliminate it. We need to seek robotic design workarounds for human values that cannot be easily optimized or reduced to algorithmic representations, whether we're talking about compassion, justice. Oh, compassion's on there twice. I guess it's that important, right? Compassion, justice, sociality, responsibility, creativity is another human value, right? That's difficult to operationalize. So if these are values that we care about, and we want our robotic systems to preserve them or promote them, we have to seek design solutions to that and figure out whether it be some sort of something that sort of correlates with this value. If we can't represent it within the system, we still need to look at the outcomes and make sure that the outcomes are aligned with the value that we care about. And then there's an open question that I want to leave for the discussion. Should we try to humanize machines directly by trying to design them with synthetic emotions, robust ethical concepts, artificial virtues, creative impulses? These are questions that Professor Sullins and I both work on and have been interested in for some time. And I think it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure still what the answer is. I'm of two minds on this, right? So one solution is to keep the machine values as they are and simply make sure that there are human checks and balances in place to protect the human values that aren't in the system. But a different approach is to say, well, then let's make the values that the robot can promote more like our values, more like justice, compassion. So we can talk about that in the question period. But I think there are reasons to worry about that prospect, even though in other respects it might be enticing. Okay, thank you very much. Questions? Yes.
You talked about a robotic mirror, so when using robots for military, if they kill someone and you were trying to put a blame on someone, instead of putting it on the robot, would you put it on the person who created the robot, since it directly...
Certainly at this point, yes, right? So there's no question right now, I think, that anything that a robot does is a human responsibility, because robots don't have the capacity for self-awareness, for taking the moral point of view, right? So they're really not capable of being moral agents or being responsible. And we talk a lot about the difference between causal responsibility and a kind of broader notion of responsibility. So it might be the case that a machine kills someone in a way that even its designers didn't intend and couldn't have predicted. So one of the risks of certain kinds of machine learning algorithms, right, we call them deep learning algorithms, have this property that they can be statistically very reliable. They can perform better than any human. This is why we have systems now that can beat humans at poker, at Go, at games that used to be the province only of the highest, most sophisticated human experts. All right, so we've got machines then that can be more reliable at really high-level judgments than humans. But every once in a while, they will issue a judgment or an analysis that just from a human standpoint is bizarre and way off the mark of what is expected. And so there's a certain degree of unpredictability built into those kinds of algorithms. It's very rare that we're going to see this, but it will be seen. So in that kind of case, you wouldn't necessarily say a designer is causally responsible for that, because the machine, in a sense, did it in a way that couldn't have been predicted or anticipated. But nevertheless, it was a human that put a system with that kind of capacity into the field that armed it, that allowed it to have that causal force on another human body. So yeah, I mean, I think humans are still going to be responsible for machines 100% for quite some time, possibly forever. Yes.
So my question is, you talk about how people are very social beings and we want to interact with others. If you did have robots take the place of jobs like caretakers or even people that have children, how would you say that maybe would affect a child's cognitive development, or even an elder person's social interactions? Because we should, to an extent, we do value people's social interactions, but I feel like with such a boom in technology, that really takes away from face-to-face interactions. And how do you think that would affect us?
I think it has to be evaluated on a case-by-case or context-by-context basis, because it depends on the specific robot and what it's empowered to do and what its affordances are and what context it's put in. So let me just give you an example. You mentioned two contexts of caregiving, children and the elderly. Mm-hmm. So we have some evidence that certain kinds of robots, when placed in elder care settings, can actually increase interaction between the elderly person who's being cared for and other humans in the environment, right? It's something, for example, that can bring residents in a care home together to interact around the robot. If that happens, right, then what you're seeing is a robot that's performing that kind of therapeutic effect where it's actually kind of strengthening human bonds. But I would be very disinclined to put any child in the care of a robot, certainly for now at all, but even if you could ensure the safety of the child in the robot's care, because of the social development of children being so fragile and so important to who they become, I would never recommend putting a child in the care of a robot for any period of time where it begins to play that kind of social role. Because we have no reason to believe that machines can bring out those social, that social maturity and moral development in children that we need. Down the road, if there's evidence to the contrary, we can consider that. I never sort of say anything's, impossible. But I think what your question reveals is that we have to think about the context. In some cases, we might have good reason to think that our social bonds can be deepened by the presence of robots. In other cases, they can be weakened or frayed, or we just don't have enough evidence to responsibly take the risk. Yes?
Wouldn't we have to develop those human values that you mentioned during the end of your lecture, the compassion, social justice, sociality, responsibility? Wouldn't we have to incorporate that into the robots so that they can actually fulfill those roles of actually caregiving for the elderly or for children? Yeah,
so that comes back to that open question. So right now, if you talk to the designers of robots, especially those that are being programmed with what we call machine intelligence, the designers will tell you there's no way to program compassion or a sense of justice into a robot. Computationally, we just don't know how that would be done. And part of my argument is that those values might be irreducibly complex in a way that will resist the kind of representation that utility maximizers can carry out. So the one question then is, all right, if we can't directly put those kinds of values into a robot, can we put proxies for those values, right? Things that aren't ideas of compassion or justice or responsibility, but will produce behavior that's more or less similar to a compassionate human or a responsible human, right? That's a much more practically promising path. But the question, there's another set of questions that raises, because humans are not very good at keeping in mind the distinction between a machine, which is a simulation of emotional behavior, and a being that really has emotions and really cares about us. So once we start building robots that have proxies, computational proxies for human values, such that they behave as if they care about those values, the possibility for manipulation and deception of humans becomes profound. So we have to really think carefully about how to mitigate that risk. Yes?
So you said there was an equation to optimize kind of human values in these machines or something, but how do you have a set equation if values are kind of I don't know, opinion based almost, they can differ between people?
Okay, so you raise a really good point here in that values and their and preferences aren't consistent among humans. So I was in a workshop where with a lot of AI scientists who were interested in these kinds of questions and interested in thinking about how you get a utility function that incorporates the moral preferences of humans. And there really is an assumption in a lot of these discussions that we're talking about the ideal human, that we can simply not think about what the actual variance among human judges is, but think about who the ideally rational and ethical judge would be, what they would care about, how they would rank their values, and then try to develop a system that will mirror that profile. I have a lot of skepticism about that concept, right? I don't think there is any one ideal ranking of human values. And I think even a very wise human often values things differently in different contexts, right? We know that the kinds of values that we might be inclined to carry out in a town hall meeting might be different than the values that we would carry out when we were sent to war or when we're at home caring for our children. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
That our own values
So
kind of
different type of algorithms.
Yeah. And most AI designers that I talk to don't want to hear about that. And for the moment, that's okay, because we don't have machines that have what we call artificial general intelligence. That's the ability to display intelligence in very different kinds of contexts to solve very different kinds of problems. We don't have that, and I don't know of anyone who's confident that we're near that point. So what we do have are machines that can be good at behaving in a very well-defined context with very specific kinds of goals. And so in a way, the problem I just mentioned doesn't arise as long as the robot is operating in a very tightly controlled context. But here's the problem. When you put a robot in a child's bedroom, when you put a robot in a public square, when you put a robot in a hospital, that's not a controlled setting. I mean, it's a specific context, but a lot of different things and different values can enter into any real world space. And so real world problems, I think, will cause that kind of value instability to come back in, and there will be friction there between the robots that can't handle that and the reality. Yes.
So I'm hoping I can articulate this the way I wanted to. So with prosthetics, it's becoming more and more engineered and robotic, and right now we have such an issue with people who have, a leg amputation using that in a relay. And how do you think that opinion is going to change throughout society if really we need to start integrating that into our younger generations, but we know that their development is so critical that it's a very murky water.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand how that's really going to become something large scale.
Well, so this is an interesting question that I think complicates the discussion that I hinted at with respect to reverse adaptation, which is that to some extent human expectations and desires with respect to human-robot relations will change and adapt, right? Just as we would never have been 30 years ago comfortable with the idea of having a conversation with our phones. Like, that would have seemed like a bizarre thing that only a crazy person would do. And then half of us now walk around having conversations with Siri on our phones or whatever, right? So our human comfort levels with different human technology relations are plastic. And that's okay. So when I say I don't want to go in the direction of reverse adaptation, I'm not saying that our attitudes towards technology shouldn't evolve. All I'm saying is that they should not be allowed to move in a direction that's contrary to our interests and the values like justice and responsibility that I don't think are, I don't think those are values we can live without, right? So I think it's an open question what kinds of human technology relations we should be comfortable with. So Elon Musk was just the other day quoted as saying, we have to merge with the machines or become irrelevant, right? Yeah, I'm not buying that. And I think that's an idea, that's reverse adaptation, right? That's telling us you have to live the way the machines live. You have to be comfortable with adopting the machine form, or else you become irrelevant. I want to avoid that kind of false dilemma. But I do think that our comfort level with different machine relations will change, and that's okay. Yes. Oh, we're done?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, everybody. And I do have an email, so if you have questions that you'd like me to answer offline, privately, I'm happy to do it. Thanks.